Okay, yeah, good evening everybody. Thanks for joining us here in the Old Arts Public Lecture Theatre at our University of Melbourne. I'm Duncan Maskell, I'm the Vice-Chancellor of the University, and I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we work and learn. And I pay my respects to Indigenous elders past and present, and I acknowledge all First Nations people present for this evening. And in particular, I acknowledge High Chief Vasili Fiti, who's the High Chief is there. Thank you for coming. And our distinguished guest speaker, of course, Dr Lagipoiva Cherelle Jackson. Thank you. It really is a great pleasure to welcome everyone to one of the university's time-honoured public lecture series. The A.N. Smith Lecture in Journalism has been held continuously since 1936, and it celebrates the university's connection with one of the pioneers of journalism in Australia, Arthur Norman Smith. A.N. Smith was a respected political journalist from the founding era of Australian democracy in the early 20th century, and was also, importantly, a founding member and leader of the Australian Journalists Association. Supported by a bequest from Mr. Smith's family after his death in 1935, this lecture has provided an important platform for expert voices to air their views on the condition and the future of journalism and media, and it will continue to perform this valuable function tonight. On that note, it is a great honour to welcome this year's A.N. Smith lecturer, Dr Lagipoiva Cherelle Jackson, who is the inaugural Climate Collaborations Editor for Associated Press. Before her new role at the AP, Lagipoiva Cherelle was a Pacific writer for the Guardian's Pacific Project, where she was host of An Impossible Choice, an award-winning series on the existential nature of the climate crisis in the Pacific. She is the first Pacific Islander recipient of the Journalists of Courage and Impact Award at the International Media Conference by the East-West Centre in 2022 for her work on covering Samoa's political crisis. Lagipoiva has reported on Samoa and the Pacific Islands for over 20 years, covering climate change, human rights and gender issues. She has contributed to Al Jazeera, CNN, AFP, Huffington Post, Radio Australia and the New Zealand Herald. Among her other public roles, she is a board member of the Oxford Climate Journalism Network at the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism at the University of Oxford. In addressing the impacts of climate change, tonight's lecture connects this year's A.N. Smith lecture with one of the most serious global challenges of our times, and one in which this university takes a deep interest across many different disciplines and areas of our work. It is therefore with great anticipation that we look forward to tonight's lecture. Lagipoiva has chosen as the title of her lecture, Va'o Matagi, Climate Journalism from the Frontlines. So, to deliver the 2022 A.N. Smith Lecture in Journalism, please welcome Dr Lagipoiva Cherelle Jackson. Thank you.
Salafalava, can you hear me okay? I like the shaking hands. Salafalava, soifo manuia, malange ma, ele malu lau fia le nea fiafi. E mua lava no fatu low I pa ia o le aso. O pa ia o le nei whanua, o pa ia o tangata nuu o le nei atu nuu, o pa ia o le Universite au au me le pone, o lo tātou whaatasi ai nei I le nei fiafi. Too low, too low, too lona ia. Ai whaapea, ua o tū lai atu nei I le aso, o au o le Lagipoiva, o le ili ili, o le suli o le Vasili Fiti, ma le tumaai. E lo'u mimita, e tau ave suafa o tua a, ua whaiae. Matu maia la ma le aso, se ia ualo atu, ia whaiva. That was basically a hello in Samoan. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the unceded land on which we are meeting here tonight, the Wurundjeri people. I am grateful and pay my respects to the traditional owners, to the elders of the past, present, and emerging. Vice Chancellor Duncan Maskell, that was a very impressive introduction you made of me. Thank you. Dr. Andrew Dodd, Director for the Center of Advancing Journalism, faculty, dignitaries, fellow Samoan students, fellow Samoan faculty, heads of media organizations, academics, fellow journalists, aspiring journalists, and all, talo falava. What a great honor this is for me to stand here tonight to deliver this lecture. In moments like this, I reflect on my late mother, High Chief Vasilifiti Moelangi Jackson, and her journey. She would travel across the world to speak at various forums, just her long flowing hair, armed with traditional knowledge, and her strength of conviction. I hope today to impart some of that strength of oratory, a legacy she and my ancestors have left behind for us. Firstly, I want to acknowledge Dr. Andrew Dodd, the handsome young man here on the right, for his kind invitation in facilitating my participation today. Thank you, Jackie, Joe, Lucy, Liam, Bernadette, for welcoming me this week. I appreciate your hospitality. I also want to thank the Australian Immigration for granting me a visa to legally enter this country. I was short of declaring my DNA to get this visa, but it's all worth it to be here with you tonight. I want to acknowledge a few people in the room before I start my remarks. High Chief Vasilifiti, my cousin from Sava'i. If you could stand up, Va'a, please. High Chief he sailed the high seas and battled traffic through Melbourne to be here. Thank you, my brother. I appreciate you. I want to acknowledge Kate Lyons, the Pacific editor of The Guardian. She's seated here. If you can raise your hand, Kate. She was my editor for 3 years, and I want to honor her drive and determination to lift the voices of Pacific journalists in her role. In my 21 years in journalism in our islands, there are very few journalists of influence who would give us the platform and support we needed to report from our islands. Kate, The Guardian, through the Pacific Project funded by the Judith Neilson Institute, was instrumental in my journey, and I am eternally grateful for their support and the freedom to report in the field and in the areas I had always the desire, drive, but not the financial support nor the platform to effectively do so. I also want to acknowledge my friend Victoria, Fleur Ramsey, for being here. They flew in to be here for this talk. That's what we do as Samoan Sisterhood. And also to Clement Paligaru, who is Fijian and is probably late because that's how Fijians operate. Not surprising. I also want to acknowledge my boss at the Associated Press, Peter, Director of Climate and Environment, for allowing me the time to be here. So today is my son's birthday. His name is Toa Matagi Tangaloa Langi. This is for my son Toa. You are indeed the brave warrior that faces the storm. He has been displaced for 2 years due to the pandemic, and I hope that in years to come, when he Googles his mother's name, if Google is still a thing, this will pop up and it will make him smile. This is the closest I have been to home since the beginning of the pandemic. I was in the US for a fellowship when Samoa's borders closed. Due to a combination of the impact of Trump's immigration policy, the burden of a Samoan passport, and New Zealand's hostility towards the returning Pacific Island citizens through their borders, I have been unable to return home since January 2020. So tonight is like a coming home for me, and I'm grateful to the University of Melbourne for giving me this opportunity. May we clap for the University of Melbourne? You are welcome to invite me again. And it is on that note I start my story. My name is Lagipoiva Cherelle Jackson. Lagipoiva means sky of 9 nights. It is a chiefly title bestowed to me by my family and stands for the 9 nights that the traditional creator, Tangaloa Langi, had to sleep to gather his strength to build the island of Savai'i, where I'm from. All Samoans, including my sisters in the front here, have names that are tied to land, sea, sky, a milestone, a relative, or an event of note. That's how we marked milestones in oral history. I start, therefore, with the value of land to our people, to the people of the Pacific, and how that story, as we told it through an impossible choice, became the story that resonated greatly to the plight of our islands. I begin, therefore, with how we came to create the masterpiece that is An Impossible Choice, a podcast series by the Guardian's Pacific Project under the leadership of Kate here. Last year, about 6 months before COP26, I get a call from Kate. She said, "I want to talk to you about something." Now, I know usually that involves some amazing story idea that I had to quickly piece together to meet a deadline, waking up random politicians in the middle of the night, harassing their children via Facebook Messenger, or getting my siblings to call up an ex-boyfriend related to the wife of the son of a certain minister, etc., etc. I have 3 sisters, so there's a lot of sources out there. So when we finally had this call, I was absolutely blown away by the proposal that she had. She wanted to tell the story of the existential crisis faced by Pacific Island atoll nations. When faced with a complete loss of land and left with the choice to leave or stay on their land once the tides rise and their land succumb to the rising seas. Lucky for her, I had 3 years of my PhD research under my belt on the very issue of state sovereignty implications of climate change and the legal recourses that islands can pursue to preserve the statehood and their legal personalities. I was in, like deeply in, and she didn't need to ask me twice. The only problem was this: it was a podcast. It was a podcast. Audio isn't my thing or her thing or any print journalist thing. Both of us are print journalists, and well, since a lot of us here are media people, we all know those are 2 different breeds of human beings. Where radio journalists are brief and succinct, print journalists wax lyrical about the most mundane of topics. Also, no print journalist has ever had to watch the sound of their voice. We use ums and ahs and say half sentences like it's going out of style during interviews. So, with an extraordinary team of podcast professionals who actually knew they existed, right? Sound professionals and researchers, we set about laying out the story we wanted to tell. I had been a part of international collaborations before, but this one was different. My colleagues were extremely respectful and were guided by my advice when it came to cultural nuances and regional relevance. At our first meeting, we had a call to flesh out the issue. We bounced ideas around and shared anecdotes from my childhood, shared stories of people I knew and my own family's experience of climate change, the cyclones, floods, and the average life of a Pacific Islander. When I wrote the first part of the script, the producers both asked if I could insert more of my story into the script. I was taken aback. You spend your whole career as a journalist taking I out of every sentence and staying far away from every piece, only to be thoroughly thrust right into it in telling the climate story. But the climate story was also my story, unavoidably so. I also lived through all of what the crisis entails. And sometimes I forget, in my pursuit to be objective and to tell the story, that I am also a survivor and an eyewitness to the climate crisis on our islands. So I obliged and peppered the whole script of the story with how I gave birth amid storms, how our entire village huddled in the church, the last remaining stronghold in our village, so we may all survive, and how the roof of that very church flew off, and we all had to seek refuge amid debris and severely injured relatives, and all the while trying to save our paralyzed grandmother who could only be carried to safety. During the podcast, I had calls with my siblings to make sure that I captured what I recalled of the earlier cyclones accurately. I was only 8. It allowed us a space to not just reflect, but also to laugh at ourselves and some of the horrifying things we went through, like my uncle hanging on the roof of our fale as it was being blown off, and seeing him hanging in mid-air, blown around like a rag doll. We all laughed collectively at that memory. That's how we deal with trauma in Samoa, like many of our islands. But reporting for international audiences requires me to shift my lenses so that the narrative suits their perception of our reality. As such, laughing about my uncle hanging from a corrugated iron roofing during a cyclone while hanging on to his lava or skirt would not go down well for some who are just becoming acquainted with the severity of the climate crisis on our islands. Bridging the divide between local reporting on climate and international reporting has been a journey. When I report to Samoan audiences, I don't need to explain certain concepts because they come naturally from lived experiences. My local readers understand the environmental shifts due to climate. My international readers have to be acquainted with the islands. It's Samoa, not Somalia. Fiji is not the same as Samoa as well. So they have to be acquainted about the islands, where they are, and what we stand to lose. In an impossible choice, I found myself discussing events that my colleagues found absolutely heartbreaking. Yet for me, it was normality. For our family, for friends who survived and continue to live in strife, this was a norm that occurred every year. But this norm had to be translated to a greater story. And I took great pride in working with my colleagues to bring the voices of island nations to the forefront. With the Judith Nielsen Institute and the Guardian's support, we reached out to field reporters who conducted interviews in local languages. I interviewed people in Samoan and dabbled in Tuvaluan during some of the interviews. For an international media outlet to do this required understanding the news landscape, reaching good talent, and taking the effort to reach the hard-to-reach places. As the only Pacific Islander in the team, I did feel responsible to ensure that we were adhering to cultural protocol and nuances in the communities we were reporting from. So for example, in Samoa, if you say thank you to someone, you say thank you on behalf of the chief. On this occasion, I had to say thank you on behalf of the owners of The Guardian and the CEO, which sounded really awkward, but it had to be done. There were 2 occasions where I noted that had a Pacific Islander not been in the room, a certain cultural nuance would not have been noted. One was a script reference to a paramount chief. One of the producers had drafted the reference and wrote the introduction to an interview of a paramount chief and stated it like this: "Our reporter interviewed the paramount chief there," in reference to a chief on an island off of Papua New Guinea. I changed the reference to the paramount chief, his name, his title, the name of the village, and the island. My colleague queried it, and I asked him at the time, would you say the Queen there? Or would you say President Biden there? If the answer was no, then this paramount chief was due his full title, place, and realm. That was an important moment for my colleague and I, as they did acknowledge the oversight. This is also a good moment to note that under Kate's leadership and with some harassment from me, The Guardian now uses chiefly titles in second reference, making it the first international media outlet to do so. I think that deserves a clap. As you know, in Samoa, if you have a chiefly title, the second reference is that first title. So Lagipoiva would be second reference in a story for local media. When we are covered by international media, the last name is usually used. So it's extremely disrespectful in print, and the Guardian had chosen to observe under Kate's pressure to then utilize the chiefly titles as per cultural protocol. The second issue was in reviewing the final version of the podcast, I found myself listening to instrumentals that one would hear from other podcasts in the UK or the US. They were sounds not native to the Pacific, nor reminiscent of the cultures that we stand to lose due to the crisis. I brought this up to Kate, and in a matter of 48 hours, the superstar editor committed to finding the appropriate music. She would listen to sounds and send me snippets for translations. At one point, she sent me a snippet of a song by a Samoan rap artist to translate and said the sound would be perfect. I listened to it and laughed. The song was about the pancake stall at the Savalalo market. Like the guy was describing going in to buy some pancakes from the stall. Yes, we rap about the weirdest stuff. So it was funny for us and very entertaining. In the end, the package came out beautifully, and we honored the voices of the Pacific and the sounds of the Pacific. I would like to acknowledge here all the amazing voices we featured, and special mention to my friend Vanessa Niwahausen, pictured here, who shared her story of her family during Cyclone Evan, when her home was wiped away and her children nearly swept away with moments to spare. I acknowledge her bravery in sharing her story and note that she and her family are some of the first climate migrants from Samoa to Australia. These stories were told because we had access, local knowledge, the Guardian's intention to tell the stories from the ground, the financial support, and willingness of the editor to do due justice to this story. But not all journalism that involves collaboration between the international and a local newsroom does justice to the story. Hi, Clement. My Fijian friend is here. He made it. The foreign correspondent and parachute journalism model continues to be problematic for the Pacific, not just for climate reporting, but for general news. We need to acknowledge that there are talented journalists on the ground who are capable of reporting the news, and relationships should be built with those journalists who cover issues from our islands without the need to send in a correspondent each time. We too can speak for ourselves. In the past, we've seen foreign correspondents miss the entire mark on local stories, which included misconstruing information to suit an international narrative. A famous case being reported by a New Zealand journalist who famously pointed out that Samoan houses built after the tsunami had no walls, failing entirely to recognize that the Samoan traditional whale indeed had no walls at all. If you want to know his name, come by afterwards. I'll let you know. It's not a secret. All the Samoans here smiling know who he is. There are nuances to local stories that cannot be fully relayed by a correspondent or a foreign journalist. As a stringer over the years, I made sure that the correspondents I worked with got the full picture and were able to relay the stories accurately. Despite having great pride along with other stringers in facilitating access and content for a story, it was always disheartening to see the end product and receive no acknowledgement. This is the old model of journalism that needs to change. Empowering local journalists and giving them due credit in the news production needs to be done. This is a good moment to reflect on Australia's coverage of Pacific issues and how it could be strengthened. I've found that more recently, Australian media have taken a knack for the China angle. If it even remotely had China involved, Australian media would be all over that. If it even, the coverage has had, and I want to say this and emphasize this, the coverage by Australian media on China's influence in the Pacific has been condescending, has had scathing inferences, and very disempowering for the peoples of the Pacific. Pacific leaders have spoken to this. Australian media have inferred that Pacific Islanders don't know what they're doing and are going blindly into it. Let's go back to climate and how Australian media cover climate. Just 3 years ago when I was here, the front page of one of the main newspapers' environment section contained a polar bear. I found that amusing, given the various examples of the climate crisis on islands and even here in Australia itself. That particular publication chose a classic Western narrative of the polar bear to once again exhibit the impact of the climate crisis. But this is not surprising. These lenses are utilized by international media the world over. Descriptions of sinking islands, drowning villages, and fleeing islanders are the common narrative. I refer to the Time cover in 2019 pictured here, where the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres traveled to Tuvalu for a visit. A Time photographer accompanied him. The front page picture that they chose was of the SG knee-deep in water in Tuvalu. Now, some might argue that this is just a magazine and it shouldn't matter, that politics and actions matter more. But this goes deeper than just a paper cover. This is about fair coverage and accurate depiction of an issue, featuring the head of the UN standing in a suit off an island with residents who are legitimately facing seawater inundation, who have to literally carry their pigs, their children, so they don't drown every year and hold up furniture to save it from flooding, is not only offensive to those going through these problems, but also a disservice to the practice of journalism. The article itself is done well and covers the issue very well. However, the fact that it was not headlined by a Pacific Islander or a Tuvaluan is a disappointing nod to the need for a westernized story lead. Having conducted one of the first studies on climate change coverage of Pacific issues by global media back in 2009 at the Reuters Institute at the University of Oxford, I found the Time cover a disheartening and discouraging metric of environmental journalism practices worldwide. My study found that at the time there was minimal coverage of climate change impacts in the Pacific Islands, and when there was coverage, it was about an issue in a developed country, with the Pacific as a small example, or the Pacific as part of Asia. The Time cover is a testament to the fact that our issues, the fate of Pacific Islanders, still continue to be marginalized and sensationalized by Western media in the pursuit of a sexy headline, while disregarding realities, sometimes facts, actual subjects of the story. Part of the problem is that we're a minority. The Pacific Islands are just not significant enough in their geography or people to warrant proper coverage or due justice by global media outlets such as the Time. We are but a mere side thought when the true impacts of climate change are covered sometimes. As such, we're either sinking, fleeing, or disappearing. But it's more than that. There are economic losses and struggling governance systems resulting from the added pressures of extreme weather events. There are capacity issues due to the complexity of adaptation measures implemented locally. And there are future existential issues that haven't even been addressed in a manner that is realistic for islanders, especially those in nations like Tuvalu. Honorable Eneleisa Puanga, Tuvalu's former Prime Minister, along with all other Pacific leaders, including our own Prime Minister in Samoa, have consistently reiterated the vulnerabilities of Pacific people over the years. Vulnerabilities founded on real fears and true experiences on an annual basis. If true journalism principles are applied, it would not matter if Sopo'anga were standing in a grass skirt. His people are the true victims, and that is the story. Not about the thought of Guterres, handcrafted leather boots and socks in the water, but rather the reality facing people whose land is slowly submerging beneath them as they themselves find ways to rise above it. But It's not all grim for Australia and international media's coverage of the Pacific. Recently, a video of a doorstop of Solomon Islands Prime Minister at the forum went viral on Twitter. When I saw the video, I cringed. I cringed because as a Samoan, we were raised not to do that to our leaders, our elders, our chiefs, or those with authority. You don't shove a mic in their face or ask a question uninvited. It's entrenched, the culture of respect, and this bleeds into journalism. At press conferences on our islands, many are quiet, and no hard questions are asked on many occasions because of this cultural protocol that we have to observe. A few things came to mind for me while watching this. One, this was a shocking display of disrespect by foreign journalists. Two, I'm not surprised that there were no Pacific Island journalists doing the same thing. Three, Western approaches of journalism is very confronting for Pacific cultures. On the flip side, however, I came to appreciate the following. One, that this is an elected leader and should answer the questions posed. Two, that our Western counterparts can do it as they don't have to face him on a weekly basis, nor are they related to him, his children, nor are people, related to you working for him. And three, that there is a critical role for the parachute journalists in this regard. They can take the hits to protect the local journalist, and they can ask the insensitive but pertinent questions. Essentially, they can break cultural protocol where we cannot to observe the practice of journalism. In the end, Songavara granted an exclusive to Fijian journalist Lithe Movono, who is pictured here. Note the stance. For even in the pursuit of truth, a Pacific Island journalist still maintains a respectful cultural standing for the elders we report on. Due to the fact our communities are small, the people we report on a daily basis are either relatives, friends, acquaintances, ex-boyfriends, ex-girlfriends, relatives of the ex-husband, friends of friends, or distant relatives. In my coverage of the measles epidemic, I leaned on my international colleagues to ask the hard questions, because two of my siblings were healthcare workers from Samoa and New Zealand, for the Samoan and New Zealand governments, and any information published with my name on it will implicate them. We're close-knit, and every controversial issue you cover will cost you a couple of relatives or friends. These are the things you make peace with when you take up journalism on islands, that you will lose half your relatives by the end of your career. Sometimes that may be a blessing in disguise. My mom would not have liked that. We tread lightly due to this, but working for international publications has afforded me a type of luxury to cover issues without facing direct repercussions at home. I do, however, reference the fact that journalists who cover politics in the Pacific continue to face threats and risks on a daily basis, whether it be offline or online. I want to honor them and their continued pursuit for truth and their courage. But these are the realities of reporting in small communities. We have to navigate cultural protocol, familial ties, and community while observing journalism best practices to the best of our abilities. Whereas journalism ethics dictate that you cannot accept gifts, the Samoan culture considers it an affront if you reject a gift. As such, we're constantly in between a rock and a hard place in observing Western journalism ethics and our own cultural protocols. In one such case, when a TV crew covers a large event in a village, they are, as per cultural protocol, given either a pig, fine mats, money, or food as an offering. It is considered deeply disrespectful to reject the gifts, whatever they may be, to the point where the crew may not be accepted back to that community if they reject the gift. As such, the TV crew, to ensure that they don't jeopardize the future coverage, have to take the offerings. We've come to an agreement in the Samoan media, among media professionals, that any offerings received are split equally among all staff or given to the management. For even giving it away will also incur the wrath of said village. And it's more disrespectful to give away the gift than to reject it. And you might think, how are they going to find out? It's an island. They will find out. You cannot escape it. In this photo, it is a classic example of how cultural protocol supersedes journalism values. Here you see TV journalist Rose Setefano fanning away flies while then Prime Minister Tuilaipa Lupesoliai Malielengoi had his lunch. Now, let me ask you this. Would you ever see an Australian journalist fanning the Prime Minister's food in Australia? Didn't think so. So I love this photo. Here, okay. She was there for an interview with him while he was attending an event. Then he did his lunch. Professionally, she is a journalist, but culturally, she is the closest young person, and as such is obliged to fan while the chief eats. It's not because she's a woman, it's because she's the youngest there. You will note the gentleman next to her is older, that's his driver. She's younger, so she has to fan. If the chief needs water while you're about to do an interview, you fetch the water. If a cultural gift is being made while you are the only young person present, you take the role of serving the chief. These are the protocols we straddle in culture while reporting on our communities. But it works for us. And when I venture into international coverage, I still honor my culture and the place I am from. I remember when I was stringing for a well-known international publication, who shall not be named, we had to interview chiefs in the village. As per Samoan culture, we cannot go empty-handed. So I had to explain to my colleague that if he sees me handing over food or money to the chiefs, to turn a blind eye, because I'm observing my cultural protocol so that I may return to that village in peace and that the name of my own family is not dishonored in the process of getting that story. So this poor journalist, who had survived wars and was a bureau chief, smiled and turned away as I handed over corned beef, loaves of bread, and sticks of butter before continuing the interview with the chiefs. But it's journalists like him that I'm grateful for, who understand when we come under threat, or we need to honor our traditions and tell the story, that they can make way for that within the framework of Western journalism ethics. These are the nuances I hope more foreign correspondents take up and respect in the future. I only hope that as Australian journalists cover more of the Pacific, that you cover it with dignity and respect as you would any community. And this is where Indigenous Australian journalists can come in. Indigenous Australian journalists have the lenses of Pacific Islanders through community, cultural practice, and similar challenges in approaching stories. By encouraging and promoting Indigenous Australian journalists in a place where they can be foreign correspondents and report on Pacific Islands, the Australian outlet can strengthen coverage through a more nuanced approach by Indigenous Australian journalists, whom I understand also face access issues in the media industry. There is room for accountability in reporting on Australia's role in the Pacific. Assumption of care compared to the actual emissions and harmful practices that continues to contribute to the problem globally needs to be reported on. At the end of the day, it has been demonstrated that Pacific Island journalists can effectively tell the story of the Pacific. So empowering local perspectives is the way forward in climate journalism. Reflecting the voices of the Pacific through local languages within the framework of our culture is essential in telling the true impact of the climate crisis on people of the Pacific. I end this talk today with my favorite Salmon metaphor. ua tangi le fatu ma le ele, which translates the rock and the heart that weeps, indicating that the earth is a living and breathing entity that suffers too, just like us. It references the death of a high chief, but in the context of the climate crisis, it is the suffering of the land and the lives that depend on it. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I honor my late mother and my ancestors for the words I spoke here today. I thank yet again the traditional owners and elders of this land for allowing me the space to be here. Whawhetai mo lenei a wanoa, a whai ua iaise upu ua sala ia mapu I whale o tau whina ngalo, ai whaama ngalo mai lenei sui. Whawhetai, whawhetai, whawhetai te lava. Thank you.